Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're looking at some incredibly comprehensive study notes to unpack a literary movement that, honestly, totally flipped how authors viewed the human condition. We are talking about literary naturalism. Look, if you've ever read a book and just felt this crushing sense of dread for the characters, like they're stuck in a maze and there's absolutely no way out, yeah, you've probably stumbled into this beautifully dark genre.
But before we really get into the history here, ask yourself something. Do you actually make your own choices, or is the whole game rigged from the start? Seriously, chew on that for a second, because your personal answer to that provocative little question is exactly what separates traditional storytelling from the intense, unvarnished offshoot that is naturalism.
So, here's our agenda for unpacking this highly scientific approach to literature, which really had its heyday from the 1880s to the 1930s. We're going to define naturalism, dig into the forces of determinism, check out its scientific influences, compare it to realism, look at the master authors, and finally wrap up with its motifs and enduring legacy.
Okay, Section 1, Defining Literary Naturalism. Let's get our primary framing device set up.
Now, I absolutely love this quote from the source material. Think of naturalism as literature looking through the lens of a microscope. It just hits the nail on the head. These authors didn't just see themselves as writers, right? They saw themselves as clinical scientists. They were studying human beings exactly the way a biologist studies animals in the wild. No romanticizing life. They wanted to slap human behavior on a slide, dial in the focus, and see exactly what made it tip.
So the real kicker here is that naturalism goes way beyond just describing everyday life. It's actually trying to scientifically determine the underlying forces that control its subjects. The writers are asking, how much of who you are is dictated by your environment, your inherited traits, and your social conditions. It's a heavy, deeply analytical way to construct a story. Moving right along to Section 2, the forces of determinism.
This brings us to the absolute cornerstone of the whole movement, determinism. This is the philosophical stance that just completely strips away human agency. In a naturalist story, a character's fate is predetermined by forces way, way beyond their control. They're trapped in this deeply pessimistic struggle against a universe they literally cannot beat. It's not that they make bad choices, it's that they don't really have choices to begin with.
And authors loved playing with the two main traps of determinism. On one hand, you've got biological determinism. This is the internal trap, the DNA, the instincts, the fatal flaws you inherit from your ancestors that pull your strings before you even take your first breath. And on the other hand, there's environmental determinism. That's the external trap, the crushing weight of your social class, your upbringing, and your physical surroundings. You are essentially squeezed right between your biology and your zip code.
Now, beyond determinism, there are a few other core characteristics you're definitely going to spot. First up is objectivity and detachment. The author acts like a cold clinical scientist just running an experiment without any moral judgment. Second, intense pessimism. Honestly, the struggles are futile, and you are rarely getting a happy ending here. Third, nature isn't this warm, beautiful mother figure. It's an indifferent, unfeeling machine that just doesn't care if a human lives or dies. And lastly, a huge focus on the lower classes. These authors ran their narrative experiments mainly on marginalized people to show how extreme, inescapable poverty basically guarantees a tragic outcome.
Let's jump to Section 3, the scientific influences. Ideas this heavy don't just pop up out of nowhere, right? Naturalism was directly molded by three massive cultural shockwaves. First, Charles Darwin. His theory of evolution was a massive influence. Characters were constantly reduced to their animalistic instincts, driven by just a raw, desperate need to survive rather than some high moral code. Then Karl Marx. His theories on class struggle and capitalist exploitation built the framework for the brutal economic traps these characters find themselves in. And finally, Émile Zola. He's the French novelist who basically founded the movement, formalizing the whole thing in his 1880 essay, The Experimental Novel. Zola literally argued that writers should drop characters into specific environments just to watch how their inherited traits react to social pressure.
All right, Section 4, realism versus naturalism.
Now, readers mix up naturalism with its parent movement, realism, all the time. So let's lock down the difference. Realism, think Mark Twain, is all about faithfully representing actual life. Middle-class characters have free will. They make ethical choices, and it all happens against a realistic but often beautiful backdrop. Naturalism, though, like Jack London, is a much more extreme branch. Here, inherited traits and brutal environments dictate everything. The characters are victims of destiny, totally driven by instinct, and trapped against an incredibly harsh, overwhelming force of nature.
Basically, one gives you a choice, and the other treats you as a casualty of the universe.
Section 5. Master Authors and Works. Let's look at some of the heavy hitters.
So, what does all this theory look like on the page? Let's put a few narrative specimens under the microscope. First up, American author Stephen Crane. He is legendary for showing just how utterly insignificant humans are when faced with nature and war. Take his famous short story, The Open Boat. It is a textbook naturalist specimen. He strands 4 men in a tiny lifeboat, and the ocean isn't evil, it's just totally indifferent to their terror. Surviving that massive force comes down purely to physical endurance and, honestly, blind chance. He also wrote Maggie, A Girl of the Streets, which is this devastating look at how a young girl's brutal, poverty-stricken environment in the New York slums absolutely destroys her, despite her starting out completely innocent. The environment always wins.
Then you've got Jack London, who took Darwin's theories and jammed them right into his literature. In To Build a Fire, a guy literally freezes to death because nature doesn't care, and this human intellect is completely useless compared to his dog's ancestral survival instincts. London's The Call of the Wild even gets into de-evolution, watching a domesticated dog revert back to a wild state. We also have Theodore Dreiser. His novel Sister Carrie illustrates how moving to a big city strips a young girl of her moral choices, leaving her dictated by this desperate craving for wealth. And of course, Émile Zola, the father of it all. His incredibly detailed novel Germinal perfectly captures the brutal, inescapable world of French coal miners, showing how the minds literally shape their entire psychological reality.
Finally, Section 6, Motifs and Enduring Legacy.
As we wrap this up, let's talk about the recurring symbols you really need to keep an eye out for. First is the beast within. This is when characters, pushed to the absolute limit by hunger or fear, start acting like animals, growling and fighting just to survive. Second is the uncaring universe. Look for those heartbreaking moments where a character looks up to the sky for help and gets absolutely nothing but silence in return. Third, the vice of the city. You'll see rapidly industrializing cities portrayed as literal monsters or traps that just chew up the weak. And lastly, chance and accident. In naturalism, a character can do everything right, make all the perfect moral choices, and still get crushed by a falling rock. Bad things just happen for zero moral reason, because life is random and there's no higher power looking out for anybody.
Ultimately, naturalism aggressively stripped away all those romantic illusions in literature. It forced society to stare at the ugly, unvarnished truths of systemic poverty, base human instinct, and deep vulnerability. Now sure, the movement faded as modernism took the wheel in the 20th century, but its legacy, it's permanent. It basically translated the very beginnings of modern psychology and sociology right into storytelling. It taught us to stop just looking at the what of human behavior and start looking for the why.
Which leaves us with this final thought. Think about the media we all consume today. The gritty social realism, the deep dives into psychological trauma, those true crime narratives that obsess over how people are shaped by their terrible environments. Next time you're watching or reading about systemic inequality, take a closer look. Ask yourself, is the grand dark experiment these authors started way back in the 1880s actually still running today? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep your eyes open for the hidden forces shaping the stories all around you.